All right, so we'll just get straight into it. Hey, we're going to go through graft considerations weeks 1 to 12 and the implication of the graft after ACL reconstruction. I'm going to skip over hamstrings because hamstrings are starting to really go out of favor. We will still see them, but all of the principles that you'll see in this, the patella and the quad tendon, they all apply to the hamstrings. The biggest difference with the hamstring graft is that when you take that medial stability away from the knee, and you'll see on the very last slide what I mean, when you take that medial knee stability away from the knee, by taking part of that hamstring, it causes longer term effects, which are kind of out of the scope of today's session, because today we'll just focus on weeks 1 to 12. All right. So what we'll do, having a look at this picture, how would you compare, let's ignore ACLs and let's ignore surgery. What if, say, it was a bicep tendon, right? So what if I had to cut out a tendon of bicep and the muscle, an aspect of the muscle? What vascular implications and what structural implications and inflammatory implications would you have if that happened? What would you guys reckon?
Like the length of the muscle itself would be, like it would always be feeling tight and shorter. So more from a structural implication.
Yep. What else? What happens when you cut out tendon and muscle like that?
There'd be a massive influx of like blood cells to the area, that kind of inflammatory soup.
Yep. When you chop out the tendon and the actual muscle fibers, what else is running inside those muscular cells and tendinous cells?
The neurological structures.
Yep. And what makes it bleed?
The vessels.
Yeah, yeah.
All the capillaries.
Yeah, so if you had to compare these grafts to just say a regular muscle strain, how do you think it's different?
It's a lot more aggressive because they kind of just peel apart like such a long strip to get the graft.
Yep. There's a lot of damage, isn't there?
Yeah.
So what we're going to go through is, I'm going to show you a video, but I want you guys to make a list of, after you've watched this video, what structures do you think are affected when harvesting a graft, right? The video is on, I'll just show you here. Just make sure I share the right screen. Cool. So it's a patella tendon graft.
We're going to harvest a patellar tendon graft. We'll kind of draw the patella out. And I'll make a big incision so everybody can really see what we do.
What structures is being affected?
Now I'll just release that peritoneum out to where you can see this whole patellar tendon a lot better. So the first thing we'll do is make a cut in the tendon itself. We'll do this same centimeter, just making that centimeter wide all the way down to the two bones. And then we'll outline on the bone the part of the bone we're going to harvest at the same time. So now we have to harvest the bone plug part. Then we just need to sort of pry it out of its little bed. So there's one end of this graft out, and then we'll do the same thing down here on the other end. Then we just have to get this free. This would be the way that this graft looks when it's all said and done. About a sip will kind of drop.
Cool. That's right at the end. That's what the graft looks like at the end.
That's so cool.
Yeah.
So I'll share this link as well. So
Yeah.
I'll give you guys just a couple of minutes. Write down all of the structures that you think are affected, and you can work together as a team.
All right, or do we say it?
You can type it if you want.
Yeah.
So we've got skin, fascia, fat pad. Then you got your tendon.
And then
You got all the bursa around there.
bursae, patella, and tibia.
Then the neurovasc, so the superficial neural structures. The vascular, superficial vascular supply.
The retinaculum.
Oh,
Well.
it's retinaculum.
Would there be an effect with that with the mid-neck?
Oh, they would be sitting in the joint line.
Yeah, but is there not a slight attachment into the retinaculum tendon? Not really.
Sure.
Not sure about that.
I'll give you a hint as well. What was the very first thing the surgeon would cut?
The skin.
Skin.
Yeah. And then what's the very deepest aspect of that patella?
The patella.
What's on that underside?
Cartilage.
Yeah.
The femur.
Of the patella, yeah. So before you get the femur, yeah, the articular cartilage.
The cartilage.
That's good. You've got a really good. So, in a lot of the time when people are speaking about ACL reconstructions, most of the media focus and most of the, especially social media influencers, they focus on stress on the graft. We haven't even touched the graft yet, have we?
No.
Yeah. So there's so much more at play, especially in the first 12 weeks. This next slide, it's a similar aspect, or when you go through a similar process, have a think about when you are harvesting that quadricep tendon graft. It's a similar thing, isn't it? And what they do is they actually take off. Let me see. Can you guys see my? No, I can't see that. Okay. What they do is they take a significant portion of that superior patella and the quads graft as well. But again, they cut through the same things: the skin, the fascia, the paratendon, the actual tendon. They will chop open all of the blood vessels. And they'll make structural damage to the quadricep tendon. Now, on the quad tendon, it just so happens that there's 3 different layers. You've got the rectus femoris conjoint tendon, then you've got the vastus medialis / vastus intermediate tendon, and those 3 different layers just end up being affected, right? And so they take it all the way up, probably 12 centimeters up into the thigh, and so you get that muscular, vascular, tendon, bone, skin, inflammatory response. Cool. So you can see there when they're harvesting that, it's exactly the same thing, and it's good to show you the actual aggressiveness of how they harvest that, because on this they take the full thickness of the patella, the superior pole of the patella. So you're left with a tiny little bit of articular cartilage underneath. And yes, that has implications down the track as well, but we'll focus on kind of 1 to 12 weeks. So let's start with resolution of a callus, right? So soft callus, then hard callus, and then remodeling and timelines. If you think about the damage to that patella, and it's separate for hamstrings, but if you think about that damage to the patella, you can look at peak hard callus formation anywhere between kind of 20 to 40 minutes, right? That's only the patella. So if you have a think about where they drill the bone tunnels through the tibia and into the joint capsule and then through the femur as well, we're talking about the same thing. So soft callus filling in those tunnels, then hard callus, and then the remodeling and the remodeling process. Now that bone remodeling process, I want you guys to think about that as similar to a tibia fracture, right? So we're actually dealing with a whole lot of different injuries compared to just an ACL graft. The other thing that a lot of the time people don't understand is that the most important thing in the first 12 weeks is actually the tendon and bone tunnel interface. Now, when you're going through this whole remodeling process where there's granulation starting to come in, you've got this callus formation starting to come in, most people and most of the arguments online are about, can you load the ACL graft to extension, open chain, closed chain? And all of the evidence that can be put forward is mid-graft strain. So you'll see, people say, well, there's zero strain between 60 and 90 degrees of open chain knee extension on the graft. But again, there's all these other tissues that have been damaged during the surgery. And the biggest thing to think about in that first 12 weeks is, well, what phase are those bone tunnels at? And where the bone tunnels are kind of sitting in and the graft is sitting inside that tibial tunnel and inside the femoral tunnel, is the soft callus hard enough to lock down on that graft? And yes, on the other end, there's probably been a significant screw or staples put in to hold it. And then at the femoral end, there's, there could be a endo button that flips over and those ends are secure. But what are the things that we're doing that are affecting this bone remodeling and clamping down on the graft within that area? So those are kind of the things to consider. And again, you can see, Perkins's timetable about lower limb union is at 8 to 12 weeks. And that's the estimate. Consolidation, we're only at 12 to 16 weeks. So all of this weeks 1 to 12, we have to consider that the patella is a fracture, the tibia is fractured, and the femur is fractured as well. So that's bone healing. Then the next questions are paratendon healing, the actual tendon healing, muscle healing, what intracapsular swelling is there, and then what is happening with the inflammatory cascade with all of these different structures, right? And so this is quite often why, and this is relating back to function, we see clients come in and they've got swelling. And even after, 4 weeks or 6 weeks, when they've got their gait patterns back and they're walking quite well, they're starting to load up, they can do step ups, triple knee extension, or triple extensions. They're starting to do a bit more loaded work. They can squat, they can do hamstring bridges. But after all of this, in that first 12-week time frame is, okay, well, what's happening at each of these different levels? So the questions are, and what I'll do, I'll pop this on pause briefly, because when I go through intracapsular swelling, I've just got to run upstairs and grab the Coke bottle analogy.
Yep.
So bone healing, when would we load that tibial fracture? What stage, right? And so a question to you guys, when would you load a tibial fracture? When would you start a tibial fracture squatting heavy?
When you've got the callus.
So, you'd want to wait till after union.
Yep.
So you're waiting a minimum 12 weeks.
Yeah, and it's interesting. So like an ACL rehab, we get people doing wall squat holds pretty much like week 3, week 4.
Yeah. And
so that's something to keep in your mind in that first 12 weeks is actually what's happening in the bone. When would you load an isolated tendon tear? So like, let's say there's a complete Achilles rupture. When would we start loading that?
few days.
Yeah. Most of the time, if there's a complete tendon rupture, we've got,
Well, we put them in a boot and then
yeah,
they'll be cut for several months because they'd be in the boot just to get all the fibers like gelling together again.
exactly. Yeah. So depending on the surgeon and depending on the strategy that the person takes, we only load those isolated tendon tears after a period of healing and immobility through a very, very high heel raise for an Achilles tendon to let that heal back. But when you look at the same thing with a quads graft or a patella tendon graft, we load that much earlier. And so the key considerations here are how do we protect the tendon and how do we encourage the tendon healing? The next one is full thickness rupture of a muscle, right? So let's say we had an isolated quad rectus femoris grade 3 full thickness rupture tear. And the number one here is just about further reading and classification. I'm calling it a grade 3 because let's call it a centimeter width. There's a full thickness rupture in that rectus femoris tendon, that muscle. When would we?
The same principles would apply, when the muscle fibers have started to come together, when they're starting to get the scar tissue, the same as above. Yeah,
correct. And so you can see with ACL that first 1 to 12 weeks, a lot of people, and I see this with a lot of strength and conditioning coaches. I see it with a lot of physios themselves who are treating themselves. They've had an ACL tear and they load all of these structures really, really early, really fast compared to if it was just that operation. So those are the things to have as a key consideration. I'm going to pause this for a second. Where is it? So the last thing to go through, there'll be extra reading on that muscle injury classification, which is from, let me go through here.
Is that the BAMIC thing?
Let me show you. You guys can see my screen?
Yeah.
Cool. This one. Yeah, the BAMIC one. The BAMIC system. So this will be further reading. And then the other further reading will be the inflammatory cascade, right? We won't go into this in too much detail now, just because I know that you guys have got clients. And that's the BAMIC classification. That's really important when you're thinking about the hamstring damage and about quad damage, right? And that's where the further reading. But how does it all relate to function? Now, the biggest thing that most people struggle with, where am I? Cool. The biggest thing that most people struggle with is swelling, right? What is happening inside the knee? Now, most of the time, I speak to people about, or all my clients, about the swelling. You'll see a lot of surgeons will push flexion and push extension. They really want to get that range of motion. But there's no point, if you think about this inflammatory cascade, if there's an intracapsular swelling, right? The knee has got a limited amount of space and it needs space for the femur and the tibia to move. And I always use this analogy. I say that your knee is like a water bottle, right? There's a little bit of synovial fluid, there's a little bit of air and space through there. And with muscular force, you can bend that, right? You can bend it and you can shape it. And that's where you get that flexion extension. And that's in a healthy, normal knee. But after surgery and all this inflammatory cascade, this is what the knee looks like, right? And then you have surgery and that intracapsular pressure increases dramatically. And you're trying to force this intracapsular pressure and you're trying to force, flexion and extension. There's no point doing that when that swelling and the inflammatory cascade is just going nuts. And so that's when in the next PD session, we'll talk about a quiet knee and how do we gain range of motion, and then we'll delve into the next steps a lot more detail, but especially that inflammatory cascade.
Cool.
So I show that to a lot of my clients, and you know, you've just got to keep in the back of your mind there's a lot of damage that happens. Cool. Any questions?
I love the Coke bottle analogy.
So much bleeding.
I was going to ask, like, from a hamstring graft perspective, and then I guess the difference between a hamstring graft in those earlier days, because I know we talked a little bit about that, where, you know, respect the healing of the hamstring as well. We limit loaded hamstring and knee flexion movements in those earlier days for the same reasons. I guess, would it be the opposite with more like how would you, I guess, protect the quads, the quad healing after a quad tendon graft if you're still trying to push into the getting that strength and movement going?
Yeah, see, and that's the thing is, if you've got a certain classification of a rectus femoris tear, what strengthening are you doing at week 6 post that tear? What strengthening are you doing at week 8 post that tear? And a lot of the time, the protection of that quadricep muscle needs to be in line with the healing phase and the healing process of the muscle. And the biggest mistake that most physios make is they do it too soon. They load things far too soon in the first 1 to 12 weeks.
Okay.
So you have
so it's just really just giving it a little bit of extra time, and before loading and adding in that extra load.
Correct. And also you think about, okay, so they've taken, you know, maybe 1 centimeter of tendon, and so your rectus femoris is affected. But what are you actually trying to activate and strengthen in those early phases? Is it your vastus lateralis? Is it your vastus medialis? Is it the VI? Is it, you know, your adductors? Is it your glutes? Those are the kind of clinical reasoning aspects that you need to think about.
Okay. All right.
Does it matter how the load's applied? So if it was an isometric or an eccentric or a concentric, like if it's an iso and we go heavy, we can like pick a range, we can be really specific and we're not changing the length. So would that be a more friendlier option then?
Correct.
Is that better like for the first like couple of months?
Yeah, 100%. And that's when you see that, you know, static quads contractions are good, because those iso contractions help with the healing and the kind of knitting together of that rectus femoris. And that's where it's all about the principles, right? So if you ignore that it's an ACL reconstruction, you just think about, okay, what damage is there to this muscle? What damage is there to this part of the tendon? And then how does that affect the patella as well? Cool. I'll let you go, guys.
Okay. Cool.